"2005 was a pivotal time in the rising popularity of Pures. Up to now, the game's updates had been incredibly generous, granting Pures access to pretty much all accuracy and damage boosts available. Jagex were still seemingly unaware of Pures and how destructive they could be. Although other types of PvP build were being explored, they were more limited. Range mage tanks like Elf Mage showed there was a defensive alternative to Pures, but rangers were at a significant disadvantage in this era. They could only make use of the magic shortbow or Kirill's crossbow, and there'd be no Eagle Eye Prayer in the game until November 2006. Tanks usually relied on lowering and farcasting, and they simply didn't have the explosive and exciting killing power that Pures could obtain at such low combat levels. This really was the era of the Pure, before the steady stream of updates that gradually nerfed them, and further still from the update which would result in the sudden and senseless destruction. As Pures gained in popularity, more players were exploring the Pure concept, trying to learn from the early pioneers. In 2005, there was no better place to learn than that of the Mayhem Makers forums. Far from being just the home of the first Pure clan, this website was now the centralised hub for the Pure world, a community becoming more and more distant from the rest of the player base. Many of the early PKing dramas were discussed on this long-lost website. One notable drama included a beef between 3HitU and Mahatma. The two were pretty much regarded as deities by the rest of the community, with 3HitU being the first Pure to max out his combat stats and Mahatma's PK videos making him one of the most famous players in the game. The two decided to settle the differences with a deathmatch, bizarrely using rules that included using dragon longswords and lobsters. From what I understand of it, 3HitU won round 1 but was disqualified for using a ring of recoil. A couple more rounds were shared and both players claimed victory, and nothing was ever really settled. But regardless, Mayhem Makers had a strong grip on the early Pure scene. The forums extended far beyond the members of the clan, with the vast majority of all high-level Pures being registered on the website and taking part in the community. With such clear advantages, it was hard to see how another clan could step up. " 2005 was seeing more low-level teams evolving into clans. One of these was a notorious Castle PKing team called Acid Project, and this team was even more strict on defense levels than Mayhem Makers. After one of Acid Project's leaders accepted a member with more than 10 defense, the leaders and the team split. Two new clans were formed in the fallout of Acid Project: Iron Legends, led by Acidy, and the strictly sub 10 defense clan, Final Ownage, led by Bonesaw PK and Ace. The two were fierce rivals for a number of months, with Final Ownage eventually taking the upper hand, and after the entire council of Iron Legends left to join Mayhem Makers, Iron Legends folded. Contrary to what many would believe, Mayhem Makers and Final Ownage were effectively allies throughout 2005. They would frequently go on joint PK trips, and together they made up the majority of strong Pures in the game. Mayhem Makers were the cream of the crop with the high levels and the prestige, while Final Ownage was smaller and still finding their footing in the game. But by today's standards, you'd be forgiven for thinking they were the same clan. Mayhem Makers continued to sweep up the rising members in other emerging teams. But against this trend, Final Ownage were managing to hold their own. Acknowledging the need to step up, they rebranded themselves as Final Ownage Elite, raising the requirements and kicking members they deemed unworthy. Very quickly, they began to foster a number of famous PKs of their own. A group led by the fame of Fear Figment and backed up by the likes of Death by Virus, I Melee Die, and Six Outlaw. With this increasing quality, one of the longest and closest clan rivalries in MMOs began to take form. It started with small things initially, flaming of forums or a wilderness backstab, but final ownage were becoming a little too strong for comfort. The two weren't quite bitter rivals just yet, but they were inevitably drifting apart, and this relationship would captivate the PR community for a decade to come. The early days weren't just about mayhem makers and final ownage elites. The sudden popularity of PK videos in 2005 was inspiring a second wave of players to create PRs, now idolising those who came before them. The playstyle of making a low-level PR with little effort and spending hours and hours mindlessly PKing beside a team of strangers was becoming a popular movement amongst the more action-seeking members of the player base. These aspiring PKers would naturally form themselves into groups in order to gain a numerical advantage in the increasingly busy wilderness. These low-level teams would be labelled as masses by the more developed clans, due to their willingness to allow any and every PR to join them. By this definition, they were less so clans, but more a group of like-minded individuals of whom most had just met. These usually formed around Varrock on free-to-play servers and consisted of low-level, immature and loot-hungry players. And to little surprise, they were usually a recipe for chaos, backstabbing and general disorganisation. You'd often see the leaders try in vain to control the anarchy, asking for no backstabbing. It was just such a huge problem back then. It was just a bunch of preteens looking for action, and if they weren't finding any, they'd often just start killing each other instead. No one really knew how to tank or combo eat, so you'd only need a couple of PRs to conspire and the fallen leader would be dead. But these teams were incredibly fun, particularly compared to the grind-heavy nature of the rest of the game. Personally, I don't think RuneScape would have ever been a game I would have played for long, if it wasn't for the chaotic fun of free-to-play PKing, and of course the friends you'd naturally make by playing the game this way. Without team capes in free-to-play, these teams would try and find other ways to represent themselves, famously choosing whatever was available in Varrock's very limited fancy dress shop. The legendary pink skirt wearing pinkies would wage war with the white aprons in World 3 for many years to come. Or Black Chaos, a vague collective of level 20 mages wearing full black robes and who would fire strike to death any poor, unknowing noobs in the low-level wilderness. The low entry point and addictive nature of PKing meant that the Varrock wilderness was swarming with low-level PRs in almost every world at any time of day. We'd spend many late nights PKing into the early hours before school, fueled by a desire to become stronger and feared, like the legends in the videos. With the free-to-play wilderness teeming with so many low-level PRs, any team that could strike up anything remotely resembling organisation had a huge advantage in these noob-filled clusters. With mayhem makers and final ownage elite mainly focused on members PKing, these three clans started forming a PR community of their own. Among these clans were a group that would later come to be known as Fatality, a clan led by free-to-play war titan 3-Hit UPR and the final name in the lineage of the clan's earlier names, Easy Ownage and Supreme Ownage. And yeah, the word ownage was pretty popular at the time. This was a clan whose history was already deeply rooted in the free-to-play wilderness, effectively filling the gap that was left when mayhem makers moved to members worlds. In this early period, Fatality would most famously clash with a clan that had taken a similar path to them, known simply as the Pures. This was the most fierce rivalry of the day and acted as a sort of prelude to the intense, hostile warring that would soon become the standard of PR clanning. Many historic clans would clash in the early PR scene of 2005, including Bloody Brains and primitive versions of what would later come to be known as Freelancers, Corrupt PRs, and Eruption of PRs. And for some, their size and stature would increase dramatically in the years to come. The number of pures in the game would only continue to increase heading into 2006, thanks to the advent of YouTube and the height of PK video culture. The vast majority of us still weren't taking the game too seriously. We were just learning how to gain an advantage on our opponents, and just enjoying the novelty of exploiting the combat system. As for the clans, it would have been ridiculous to suggest some that would still be around 15 years later. But 2006 would be a year that sees the element of competitive warring established within the vast community of clans that was beginning to form. And this was the ingredient that has seemingly taken pure clans to virtual immortality.